An entitled preacher and his assistant go to my grandmother's deathbed, demanding that she write them and the church into her will. But after being deeply hurt and highly offended by their hypocrisy, my grandmother, even beyond the grave, decided to get some revenge by exposing them for the awful people that they really were, as well as humiliating them in front of the entire community. And I've never been happier to witness this all firsthand in my life. Here's what happened. So my grandmother was a member of a large conservative Bible-believing church for her entire adult life. This church, which I'll call Big White Church, was a member of a large evangelical denomination. Big White Church was located in a prosperous suburb of a large city in the Bible Belt of the deep south of the US. Now, Grandma was very active in Big White Church. She worked in the nursery every Sunday morning, helped cook hundreds of church fellowship breakfasts and dinners, accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church retreats and choir tours, taught youth Bible study on Sunday nights, and was very active in supporting home missions, as well as helping with our youth programs. She always paid her tithing and often gave extra for missions and special offerings. Grandma's greatest talent was making other people feel important. I've seen this firsthand many times. Although I belonged to a different church, I often visited with Grandma, and when I did, I usually went to Big White Church functions with her. I've seen her single-handedly cook breakfast for dozens of Big White Church youth members, which is a task that took over 2 hours, even in the church's large kitchen. Then, after the meal, she asked the group for a round of applause for the high school student leader for doing such a great job of organizing the prayer breakfast. I remember that on a church youth retreat at a rural church camp, she drove most of the night to go back to the city and retrieve a big box of evangelical materials that one of the assistant pastors had forgotten and asked her to go get. And this was all in time for our morning program the next day. His senior, the senior pastor, never found out that the assistant pastor had messed up or that my grandma had fixed it for him. And the assistant pastor never even thanked my grandma. Even though I was a child, this bothered me so much that I ended up asking her about it, but she said that she didn't mind at all. She told me that her reward would be that those materials would help children find Jesus. So overall, my grandma was just a good person. But unfortunately, the church would try to take advantage of my grandma in the worst way I could even imagine. Now, my grandma's service to her church ended abruptly at the age of 73, and that's when she broke her back in a car accident. Afterwards, for the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound and could not go to church because of this injury and declining health due to old age. Her mind was just as sharp as ever, and her faith remained sincere, but her body wore out a little more every day. During those 10 years, she made many efforts to reach out to the church, its leadership, and her church friends, inviting them to visit her at her home, etc. But it was all absolutely without success. Every one of those invitations was declined or simply ignored. Near the end, when she was in home hospice care, she decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandpa called her church and asked for the senior pastor, whom she had known for over 30 years, to visit her so that they could plan the memorial service, which she and grandpa wanted to be held at the church. Now, the pastor was too busy, but the assistant pastor stopped by a few days later. According to my grandpa, here's what happened at that meeting with my grandma literally on her deathbed. My grandma, grandpa, and the assistant pastor discussed her funeral for a couple of minutes. Then the assistant pastor started pressuring her. He said to her, "You need to lay up your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will." But my grandpa interrupted him and firmly told him that this is neither the time nor the place to discuss her will. They went back to discussing the funeral for a few minutes. Then the assistant pastor steered the conversation back to my grandma's will, with liberal injections of how badly her church needed her support. Grandpa told him several times that it was inappropriate to talk to grandma about her will or the church's financial needs because she was terminally ill and in an enormous amount of pain physically. The assistant pastor would agree and briefly talk about the funeral, but would then go back to talking about the church's financial needs, as well as heavenly rewards, while also quoting scripture. It was at this point that my grandma started to cry. To put this into context, my grandma was more than a steel magnolia. She was titanium coated with diamond wrapped in Kevlar. She rarely ever cried, and never ever cried about herself. Not one tear when the doctor told her that her back was broken so badly that she would never walk again, nor during the following 6 months in futile rehab. She would shed sincere but well-managed tears at funerals and while visiting family members in the hospital when they received bad news. She would cry to console others, and she would weep with those who weep. But nobody, not grandpa, not her daughter, nor any of my uncles or grandma's siblings ever remembered her crying for herself. My grandma was sobbing uncontrollably. My grandfather, who's a retired steelworker, a former Marine sergeant, and a Korean War combat veteran, physically grabbed the pastor and escorted him out of their house. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Grandma lived for another 6 months, mostly because of sheer force of will. Eventually, though, Grandma passed away, and we held her memorial service at the funeral home, not the big white church. The senior pastor and the assistant pastor were conspicuously absent. In fact, there were no professional Christians from the big white church. They were not at the service at all, not even in the audience. To start the service, Grandpa stood at the podium in front of the crowd and said the following: "Some of you may have heard that I disinvited the senior pastor and the assistant pastor from this funeral service. This service is not an appropriate place for me to give you my reasons for doing so, although you all know me, and so you know that my reasons are good ones. Also, my wife asked me to exclude them. This funeral service may be different from other funerals that you have attended. It is going to be an open microphone funeral. Everyone who wants to say something is invited to come up here and describe your friendship with my wife. Tell a story about her that is worth remembering, or anything else you want to say that will honor her memory and bring comfort to everyone here today. I have asked several family members to prepare statements, but you don't have to have anything prepared. Please, if you want to say something, come up here and do so." There were about 100 people at the funeral service. At least a third of them eventually stepped up to the microphone. The service, which had planned to last about 30 minutes, lasted over 2 hours, and as best as I can tell, not one person left early. There was laughing, crying, and hugging. 3 of my grandchildren played some of her favorite songs on the piano and guitar. We all joined hands and sang her favorite hymns. Afterwards, dozens of people told my grandfather that it was one of the most comforting and uplifting funerals they had ever attended. More than a few had remarked that funerals are better without preachers anyways, or something like that. Fast forward, and a couple of weeks later, it was time to start distributing what was in my grandma's will. Although Grandma and Grandpa dearly loved each other, they had separate wills because, as she told my mom, that makes it easier for us to respect each other's turf, and because their lawyer had recommended it. Nobody thought that my grandparents were wealthy. They had lived in the same small but charming house in a prosperous, well-maintained suburban neighborhood for the past 50 years, and had worked hard and lived modestly, but it was rumored that they had a very nice nest egg. Of course, there is no legal requirements for anyone to attend the reading of the will, or to even have a reading. Modern telecommunications and near universal literacy have made this quaint custom practically extinct, but the reading of the will was a tradition in our family because it was one of those events that gave our close-knit extended family an excuse to get together. We never had family reunions. They were too difficult to schedule for our large family, but we got together at birthdays, holidays, funerals, baptisms, you name it. So if you attended several of these, you would see just about every one of your cousins, aunts, uncles, and even great aunts and uncles who were grandma's and grandpa's siblings and in-laws. With this family tradition in mind, many of our family members' wills often contained very personal items that had very little cash value, but were the departed family members' way of telling their loved ones that they wanted to share a cherished memory with them one last time. As an added incentive to attend, the family rumor mill had been buzzing with speculation, encouraged by my grandfather, that my grandmother's will contain some surprises. The reading was held in a conference room at a lawyer's office. Unsurprisingly, the attendees included my mom, as well as aunts, uncles, great uncles, and many of the grandchildren. We were all surprised, however, to see the senior and assistant pastor from Big White Church. They informed us that Grandma's lawyer had told them that Grandma's will had something not only for the Big White Church, but also for them personally. Now, maybe this was just our imagination, but my siblings, my cousins, and myself couldn't help notice that these preachers appeared to be actively salivating over their good fortune at my grandma's generosity. Grandma had a large family, so a sizable number of beneficiaries were named in her will. The lawyer's conference room was a bit smaller than an average middle-class living room. Extra chairs had been brought in, every seat was filled, and people were standing in every remaining space. There was barely space for all of us. Grandma's lawyer suggested that the senior pastor and the assistant pastor sit in chairs which were in the front of the room, next to himself. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant that the lawyer and these two preachers were the only ones who were directly facing everyone else. Although the preachers were gratified to be physically next to the center of attention, they did not notice, as all of the rest of us quickly noticed, that these seats made it easy for everyone else in the room to watch watch them closely, and practically impossible for them to leave the overflowing room before the entire meeting was over. And this is because they were the furthest from the room's single door, and there were almost 24 people standing or sitting between them, and it was their only path to escape. Now, the gifts in the will were very generous, but pretty much what we had expected. Grandpa kept their house, its contents, their retirement accounts, and everything that remained after everything was satisfied. Children, grandchildren, and several local charities received nice, but not extravagant amounts of money. Several sentimental items were named and given to various friends and relatives. Grandpa was the first beneficiary listed in the will, but after him, all of the other bequests were arranged in order of increasing worth. They started with sentimental items, which had very small cash value. Then each grandchild received several thousands of dollars. Then each son, daughter, brother, sister, niece, and nephew received a little bit more. Then several local nonprofits received very nice amounts of money, and on it went. The bequests to the big white church, the senior pastor, and the assistant pastor were almost the last one listed in the will. They listened politely to the other people, but with steadily growing anticipation as they noticed the exponentially upward trend in Grandma's will. When Grandma's lawyer got to the big white church and the preacher's part of the will, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I announce these bequests to the big white church, as well as to the senior pastor and the assistant pastor, the grandmother requested that I read the following statement to everybody present." He opened a letter that was written in Grandma's own handwriting, and this is what it had to say. "For the past 10 years, not one person from Big White Church has ever called me. They've never come to visit me or sent me a note to tell me that they cared about me. Not one minister, not one deacon, not one of the church women, not even a church member who I worked with for all those years and loved dearly and thought that they were my friends. None of them showed up. I worked very hard for you when you needed me for many, many years. But when I needed you in your church, you all pretended that I didn't exist. I only got one visit when I was dying, and I invited the senior pastor to come to my house and help me plan my funeral. This was my last attempt after many attempts that I made over the past 10 years, just to reach out to my church and pastor, whom I still love dearly, even though they had made it clear that they did not love me. If only I could have my funeral at my church. Maybe some of my church friends, whom I had not seen in a decade, would come to the service to see me one last time. And I know they love to hear the senior pastor preach. So if he preached at my funeral, maybe they would come to my funeral to hear me, even if they would not have come to see me. But the senior pastor couldn't find the time to visit me, or even call me to tell me whether or not he was willing to preach at my funeral. The senior pastor came to my house, but he didn't want to talk about my funeral. He just wanted me to remember his church in my will. That's all. Just remember his church in my will. It was then that I realized I had allowed my church to break my heart for one last time. But that was the last time, the very last time. The assistant pastor did not know it when he visited me, but Grandpa and I had already prepared my will long before his visit, which did include a double tithe, literally 20% of my entire estate, for what was now my former, very former church, the Big White Church. This amount was going to be at a significant amount. The lawyer then named the amount, and it was an enormous amount of money. It generated muffled wows from many of her heirs, including me. The letter continues, but I got the feeling badly that we had not personally remembered such nice people as the senior pastor and the assistant pastor, so I changed my will to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money that I left to the Big White Church to match all the love that they have shown me during the last 10 years of my life, when I was suffering and lonely, and no longer able to work my butt off for them for free, like I had done for almost half a century. The lawyer then said that is her entire written statement. Now let's get back to the bequests in the will. The assistant pastor gets 1 cent, the senior pastor gets 1 cent, and the Big White Church gets 1 cent. The senior and assistant pastor sat there looking like someone had just injected a gallon of Novocaine into their jaws. Every one of Grandma's family and friends felt an overwhelming urge to laugh out loud, but we kept quiet because we knew my grandma. We knew she wasn't finished yet. Grandma was simply setting them up for a 1-2 punch. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss it. There is one last bequest, the lawyer continued, and this one goes to a charity. The lawyer named it, and for the sake of the story, I'll just call it the Black Charity. He then paused before naming the amount. Now, most of us had no idea what the Black Charity was, but by the looks on their faces, we could tell that the senior and assistant pastor knew about the Black Charity very well. Their faces displayed the same expression of shock, dread, and horror that they would have had if the lawyer had said that this money is going to the demonic baby eaters to buy extra large rotisserie barbecue grills and tons of charcoal. Every eye in the room was now fixated on the pastors. The lawyer, who happened to be my uncle, one of my grandma and grandpa's sons, let the silence continue a few more seconds. Now, if we had been able to read the pastors' minds, we would have known the history behind the looks on their faces. The black charity was sponsored by a large black church just a few miles from the big white church. They ran a free food and clothing bank, assistance programs for foster children, home delivery of pre-cooked meals for homebound seniors, legal aid, and other social services. A long time ago, the big white church, which was and still is 100% Caucasian, had provided a few years of financial and other support to the black charity. Then there was a very bitter, acrimonious breakup, allegedly because the black charity was practicing the social gossip, while the big white church was preaching the true gospel. The big white church even sued to try and get some of their money back, although the suit was eventually settled and very little money actually changed hands. But this being the Deep South, everyone knew the real reason why the big white church, or any white church, would suddenly stop supporting a black charity. And basically, it boiled down to the fact that they were racist. Grandma and Grandpa had seriously considered leaving big white church at that time, but they had reasoned that it was better to stay there and teach tolerance by their words and example. They knew they would never persuade everybody, but maybe they could reach some of the youth at their white church and break the generational cycle of racism. Grandma used to tell us, "My church is a mission field," and we did not learn the true depth of her statement until after she passed away. Since then, Grandma and Grandpa had secretly sent a portion of their tithe to the black charity every month. Most of Grandma's family, including me, didn't find out about any of this until after the meeting had ended, but the senior and assistant pastor obviously understood what Grandma, by her actions which are more powerful than words, was saying to them. If you had grown up as a white person in the Deep South as Grandma and Grandpa, as well as the senior and assistant pastor had, then you would understand. To many white Southerners, this was one of the most personally insulting things you could do to them. It simultaneously labeled them as racist and condemned their awful behavior and crushed their delusions. Having allowed time for everyone to observe the senior and assistant pastor while they thought about how their white church had treated this black charity and how they and their church had treated our grandma, the lawyer then said the amount of money that was going to this charity, and they named the exact amount of money that my grandma had named in her handwritten letter, which was the huge amount of money that would have gone to the big white church if she had not changed her will. My grandma was one of the sweetest, most generous, forgiving, and charming people I've ever met. She was not vindictive at all in the slightest, but honestly, everybody has their limits. Being her grandson is one of the best things that ever happened to me. Because of her, my grandfather, and other members of my family, plus my many friends, I am truly rich in all the things that really matter. Man, this story really hit some hard points. Like, first and foremost, those pastors should be ashamed of themselves, including all of the supposed friends from that church. Like, seriously, they are awful people. They're the typical person who doesn't practice what they preach, and they don't look after somebody who did so much for them. I mean, seriously, this grandma was very devoted to her faith. She did everything as a volunteer, she did a thankless job to try and help these awful people out, and she considered it her mission to try and help these people see the error of their ways. That is some serious dedication. If I knew exactly what this grandmother knew about these people and the way they treated that other charity, I probably would have left and been like, no, I'm not going here. But it takes some serious guts to be like, no, I'm going to try and help them out. I'm going to help them see what's wrong with the way they think, and I'm going to try and lead the children away from this horrible way of thinking. Like, that's honestly such a noble thing to do, and she was probably one of the only people who actually practice her beliefs. Like, she literally drove out of her way just to cover the stupid assistant pastor, only to then have them go into her home, literally on her deathbed, and be like, remember your church, you gotta give us money at the end of the day. Well, guess what, buddy? She was already planning on doing that until you came in there and tried to do some mafia shakedown. Like, seriously, what is his problem? Who in their right mind would go into somebody's home and be like, hey, you need to pay us, remember? Yeah, sure, the funeral, you're passing away, we get it. But no, you gotta give us money because, you know, you gotta lay your treasures up in heaven. Like, dude, what are you talking about right now? You're insane. This is so unbelievably inappropriate, it's honestly not even funny. I can only imagine how angry the grandfather was, as well as the restraint he had towards that assistant pastor. Like, seriously, anybody who uses their religion to try and squeeze money out of your pockets or try and make you feel bad or guilt trip you into giving them money, they are an awful person. I don't care what religion you're from. It's one thing to give like a charitable donation contribution of some kind, or even like a tithe or some kind of like donation of your own free will, but it's another thing to have some absolute jerk come in there and basically shake the money out of you. And not to mention the fact that they're only coming into her house because she's passing away and they thought there was some kind of pretty penny to get out of her. Meanwhile, she broke her back and it's been 10 years since anybody showed up. None of her friends, none of the religious leadership, literally nobody came to her aid. And that's not fair in the slightest. But the way that this grandma got back at these people was absolutely beautiful. They stuffed those stupid preachers right at the front of the row. They wanted them front and center so everybody could see their shame. And they got exactly what they deserved. Absolutely nothing. Because their demeanor is hardly that of somebody who follows their religion. They were only there to try and get money out of this woman and take advantage of her one last time, even from the grave. But honestly, in my opinion, the way she got back at these people was absolutely beautiful. She threw them right under the bus and knew exactly where to hit them the hardest. So good for her as well as your family for being able to find some kind of resolution for this issue. Your grandma sounded like an awesome lady, and she sounded like someone who absolutely practiced what she preached. And the fact that she was still able to get back at these people while still giving to a really good cause is honestly the best kind of karma anybody could have ever wanted. Thanks for watching. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. To finish listening to all the stories, check out the playlist at the top of the description. And if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Jerk, check out Am I the Genius. Everything will be linked in the description.